When Admiral Thex'rax surrendered the hegemony's entire invasion fleet to a university librarian, his final transmission contained just 4 words. How is this possible? The answer was simpler than he could have imagined. Mark Harrington had spent 3 months convincing the galaxy's most sophisticated military intelligence that a bunch of history books were actually a superweapon. But that's getting ahead of the story. Let me start with the moment when the deadliest information warfare campaign in galactic history began with a man alphabetizing his tea collection, while refugees from the outer colonies hammered on blast doors, demanding answers no one could give. The Kepler University archives smelled like ozone and terror. Dr. Mark Harrington could taste the electrical discharge from overloaded quantum storage systems, while 12 species moved in careful chaos around him, each trying not to trigger the other's panic responses. Mark sat in his corner office, which looked like an information archaeologist's dig site. Layers of research buried under newer discoveries, everything catalogued but nothing quite organized. Historical propaganda posters covered walls where academic achievements should hang. OSS training manuals from Earth's Second World War shared shelf space with Machiavelli's The Prince annotated in 7 languages. His grandfather's compass rose caught the emergency lighting, like a promise that survival was just applied creativity with better footnotes. The old merchant marine had survived 3 pirate attacks with nothing but cargo containers and creative thinking. Mark, his voice echoed in memory, navigation isn't about knowing where you are. It's about knowing where you're going and being willing to adjust your course when the currents change. Your species actually plan to distribute false information? Sefnara's crystalline features had shifted to the pale blue of academic horror. The Valorian librarian held his research tablet like it might contaminate her with the concept of deliberately deceptive scholarship. This violates 17 principles of academic integrity. Mark unconsciously organized the papers on his desk by subject: military history, information theory, ethical philosophy, while studying his friend's distress. Somewhere between cataloging xenoanthropology texts and sharing terrible coffee, she'd become someone whose opinion mattered to him. We called it applied narrative engineering, he replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses the way he did when helping confused undergraduates navigate the card catalog. Sometimes the most important truth is the one your enemy never discovers. Through the archive's transparent walls, he could see evacuation transports loading civilians from colonies the hegemony had already sterilized. Good people. The Chen family. He'd helped them research their genealogy just last month. Little Sarah Chen had written a report about her great-grandmother's lullabies for his folklore documentation project. Now, Colony Tertius was gone. Sarah's lullabies were extinct languages. The emergency alert system screamed across 30 different audio frequencies, each species' version of impending doom harmonizing into something that sounded like the universe itself crying for help. "Dr. Harrington," Sefnara whispered, her voice barely audible above the evacuation alarms. "They're saying the outer colonies are gone. Completely gone." Elena's last transmission. She couldn't finish. Mark's hands stilled on his grandfather's compass. Dr. Elena Vasquez, his former graduate student, brilliant researcher, terrible at turning in assignments on time. Now leading evacuation efforts she'd never been trained for because someone had to try saving people. "What if we're next?" Sefnara asked. Mark looked at his friend and felt something crystallize in his chest. The same feeling his grandfather must have experienced when Somali raiders appeared on the horizon, expecting easy prey. "Then we make sure they regret trying," he said quietly, opening his laptop with the decisive click of someone who'd just accepted a challenge he'd been preparing for his entire academic career. But first, he had one small test to run. Mark's fingers trembled as he accessed the university's archaeological database. Just one entry, one tiny mislabeling that would redirect a single hegemony scout probe. Historical survey, entry 847 Delta, he typed, his red correction pen lying forgotten beside the keyboard. Preliminary archaeological evidence. Ancient communication array. Grid reference 447.7. The description was technically accurate. There was an ancient communication array at those coordinates. It was just that the array was actually a decorative fountain in the university's east quad. dating back roughly 37 years to the Campus Beautification Project. Mark stared at the entry for 3 full minutes. In graduate school, falsifying sources meant academic death. Now it might mean actual salvation. He thought of his dissertation advisor, Harrington. Accuracy is the scholar's sacred duty. Sorry, Professor Chen, Mark whispered, hitting submit. But some duties are more sacred than others. Within hours, intercepted communications showed hegemony scouts reporting unidentified archaeological structures of potential strategic significance. At the fountain's location, their reconnaissance teams spent 12 hours analyzing decorative stonework and ornamental water features, searching for military applications that existed only in Mark's imagination. Mark watched them through long-range sensors, cataloging their confusion with the same methodical precision he'd once used for academic research. His hands had stopped shaking. Grandfather, would you recognize the man I'm becoming? The compass rose seemed to catch the light differently now. The university's emergency assembly felt like academic conferences where everyone knew the keynote speaker was about to announce budget cuts, the same polite desperation, but with higher stakes that could erase civilizations. Admiral Thex'rax stood at the podium, his ceremonial scales dulled by exhaustion and the weight of tactical assessments that translated to "we're mathematically fucked" in 12 languages. His homeworld was next on the hegemony's target list, a detail he tried to keep out of his voice, but couldn't quite manage. Hegemony forces have achieved total victory in the outer systems, the Admiral announced, professional calm barely masking desperation. Estimated fleet strength, overwhelming. Defensive capabilities, insufficient. Civilian evacuation, ongoing but incomplete. Mark sat in the back row, taking notes in a cipher that looked like medieval manuscript illumination. Around him, faculty members whispered prayers in languages that had evolved on worlds now reduced to radioactive debris. The mathematical precision of their terror was almost beautiful. His tablet chimed with a message from Elena on Colony Tertius. Mark, we're loading the last transports. If you're reading this, it means we didn't make it. I'm sending you the children's folklore files. Someone should remember the lullabies. Tell people how we tried to save everyone. Mark's red pen rolled off his desk and clattered to the floor. Standard defensive protocols are inadequate. Admiral Thex'rax continued, his voice carrying strain. Hegemony intelligence gathering follows established reconnaissance patterns. They utilize honorable warfare doctrine, direct engagement, mathematical optimization of force deployment. Mark stopped writing and looked up with the expression of someone who'd just heard a tactical assumption that would make Sun Tzu commit ritual suicide. He unconsciously checked wind direction, an old habit inherited from his grandfather, and felt the currents shifting. He raised his hand. The auditorium's attention focused on him like targeting lasers, painting a single point. Admiral Thex'rax turned toward him with the wary respect of someone who'd learned that academics asked dangerous questions. Dr. Harrington. Admiral, Mark said, adjusting his glasses while his mind automatically organized tactical possibilities like a card catalog. What prevents the hegemony from using unconventional intelligence methods? The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that preceded either breakthrough discoveries or complete civilizational collapse. Academic historical analysis has limited application to contemporary military reality. Admiral Thex'rax replied, though uncertainty crept into his voice. Mark stood, movements deliberate, as someone approaching the podium at an execution. That's exactly what Marcus Crassus said about Parthian horse archers. Right before they turned 7 legions into a historical footnote, using tactics he considered uncivilized. Elaborate. Superior enemies expect inferior forces to fight using methods they don't understand. Mark's voice carried across the auditorium like a weapon being loaded. When you refuse to meet those expectations, when you make them fight battles they've never trained for, he gestured to his notebook, where sketches of historical battle formations shared space with organizational charts of academic information systems. Sometimes the most effective strategy is the one your enemy can't predict, because they've never considered that anyone would be creative enough to try it. Admiral Thex'rax studied Mark with the expression of someone whose understanding of strategic reality was undergoing emergency reconstruction. Around them, faculty members leaned forward with the intensity of scholars, recognizing a paradigm shift. "What do you propose, Dr. Harrington?" Mark closed his notebook with the careful precision of someone who'd just volunteered for a suicide mission disguised as research. "Give me access to the communication systems, Admiral. Let me conduct some preliminary research." "What kind of research?" Mark's smile would have made his grandfather proud and his ethics professor weep. "The kind that turns libraries into weapons." The abandoned communication center hummed like a library after closing. All the urgent whispers gone silent. Leaving only the echo of desperate conversations, Mark transformed the sterile facility into something his grandfather would have recognized as a war room if war rooms came equipped with proper citation management systems. His fingers moved across crystalline interfaces with the focused intensity of someone performing archaeology on living information systems. The first discovery would have horrified every ethics committee in the galaxy. Hegemony intelligence verification protocols were mathematically elegant, systematically thorough, and completely vulnerable to anyone who understood the difference between accuracy and truth. "Fascinating," Mark murmured, pulling up intercepted enemy communications while his coffee grew cold in the cup marked "World's Most Dangerous Librarian." The irony tasted bitter now. They've created an intelligence system optimized for preventing false information from corrupting their decision-making processes. He thought of it as archaeology in reverse. Instead of uncovering old lies, he was burying new truths. The hegemony's mathematical precision made them sitting ducks for anyone creative enough to provide false information that met their verification standards. Mark began typing with methodical precision, constructing what appeared to be legitimate scholarly research: defensive infrastructure, analysis, Kepler sector strategic assets, preliminary archaeological survey, complete with proper citations, peer review references, and mathematical modeling that would satisfy any academic integrity algorithm. The document was a masterpiece of applied scholarship, every fact meticulously researched, every conclusion properly supported, every detail mathematically verifiable. The only unusual aspect was that every single piece of information described things that existed only in Mark's imagination. "Applied narrative engineering," he whispered, uploading the document through academic channels that would distribute it across intelligence databases throughout the sector. "Never lie to your sources. Just arrange for them to discover convincing evidence of something that isn't actually happening." His tablet chimed with the first hegemony intelligence request. Query: Sector Defensive Capabilities Assessment. The university's systems responded immediately, providing Dr. Harrington's research with the full authority of academic peer review and institutional verification. Mark watched enemy analysts download his fictional defensive assessment with the satisfaction of someone who'd just convinced the galaxy's most sophisticated military intelligence that his history books were actually targeting computers. But as he opened protocols for the next phase, his hands trembled, not with nervousness this time, but with something else entirely. The quantum arrays were picking up transmissions from the outer colonies, final messages from evacuation ships that hadn't made it to hyperspace before hegemony forces arrived. Elena's transport had been destroyed 6 hours after her last message. Mark touched his grandfather's compass and remembered the old man's voice. "Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is become someone your ethics professor warned you about." "Phase 2, Mark said grimly, beginning the Ghost Fleet protocol. "Let's see how they handle fighting phantom enemies." Mark's hands dissected the university's educational simulation systems like a surgeon exploring a patient's nervous system. The holographic training platforms, designed to teach alien students about historical space battles, now projected sensor signatures that would convince enemy reconnaissance they were facing impossible odds. But first, he had to test the concept. "Computer, initiate training exercise, Prometheus 7, Mark commanded, activating protocols that officially existed to demonstrate pre-contact human naval tactics. Parameters: single-vessel reconnaissance pattern, Roman stealth methodology adapted for contemporary sensor technology. One holographic projection materialized. a single ghost ship moving through normal space. Mark monitored incoming hegemony scout reports with growing satisfaction. Within minutes, enemy analysts were reporting unidentified vessel utilizing unknown propulsion signatures. They're seeing educational simulations as real ships, he murmured, watching enemy reconnaissance teams scramble to categorize impossible sensor readings. Time to give them a whole fleet of impossible things. Mark expanded the parameters. Computer. Generate full training scenario. Historical fleet maneuvers. Maximum complexity. The systems complied with academic enthusiasm, generating holographic representations of Earth's ancient military formations translated into three-dimensional space. What appeared on long-range sensors was a coordinated defensive fleet moving through the sector in battle formations that violated several laws of physics. Mark monitored incoming hegemony reconnaissance reports with the grim satisfaction of someone watching his grandfather's chess lessons finally pay dividends. Enemy scouts detected organized defensive preparations, coordinated ship movements, and evidence of military capabilities that suggested the Kepler sector contained significantly more resistance than their intelligence projections had indicated. Reconnaissance Report 47 Delta confirms defensive fleet positioning consistent with mathematical deployment optimization. He read from intercepted communications, his coffee cup leaving ring stains on classified intelligence assessments. Estimated enemy strength. Significant numerical parity with invasion force. The beautiful part was watching them verify information that was technically accurate and completely fictional. Their sensors detected real energy signatures from educational simulations. Their tactical computers confirmed proper fleet spacing of holographic projections. Their intelligence algorithms verified defensive capabilities that existed only in properly documented academic research. But as Mark prepared to expand the deception, his tablet chimed with a priority communication from Admiral Thex'rax. Dr. Harrington, our actual defensive fleet is positioned in subsector Gamma, preparing for conventional engagement. Please explain sensor readings indicating massive fleet presence at your location. Admiral, Mark replied with academic precision, your reading echoes from historical research simulations. The hegemony's sensors are interpreting educational materials as actual military assets. The response came back immediately. Continue your research, Dr. Harrington. Expand scope as needed. Mark opened Phase 3 protocols and began implementing what he privately called cultural exploit hacking, turning the enemy's own integrity against them. But as he worked, intercepted hegemony communications painted an increasingly desperate picture. Their fleet commanders were reporting sensor readings that contradicted established physics. Their intelligence analysts were requesting verification of defensive capabilities that shouldn't exist. Through his office windows, Mark could see the memorial garden where they'd planted trees for every colony the hegemony had sterilized. Elena's tree was still just a sapling, a Terran oak that would take decades to mature. Mark realized with growing unease that he was pushing them toward decisions that desperate people made when they believed they were facing impossible odds. Desperate enemies did desperate things. And desperate things got innocent people killed. His grandfather's compass seemed to pulse with each intercepted transmission describing impossible defensive technologies and sensor readings, indicating reality inconsistencies. Grandfather, what do you do when the currents you're reading might drown everyone? Mark's analysis of intercepted hegemony communications revealed their most fundamental vulnerability, Honor Protocol 7, which required field commanders to provide accurate intelligence assessments to their superiors. They were constitutionally incapable of lying to their own command structure, a weakness that would have made Machiavelli weep with joy, which meant they were about to tell their admiral that they were facing enemies who could bend physics. Computer, initiate deep penetration communication protocols, Mark said, his voice hoarse from hours of strategic deception. Academic research access to hegemony lower-level reconnaissance networks. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Never lie to your source. Just arrange for them to discover convincing evidence of events that aren't actually happening. Mark began providing accurate intelligence about fictional scenarios, using the university's archaeological sensors to emit readings consistent with his fabricated defensive installations. When Hegemony reconnaissance teams detected energy signatures that correlated with ancient defensive technologies, they dutifully reported their findings up the chain of command. Because the sensors were detecting real energy signatures, the archaeological data was properly documented and peer-reviewed. The defensive installations existed in academic databases with mathematical precision. They just happened to be describing scenarios that existed only in Mark's increasingly elaborate fiction. Reconnaissance report. 52 Gamma confirms activation of previously unknown defensive technologies. Mark read from enemy intelligence updates, his hands shaking slightly as he realized the scope of what he was creating. Recommend tactical assessment modification pending analysis of ancient military capabilities. His tablet buzzed with an encrypted message from Sefnara. Mark, are you in the archives? The evacuation transports are asking about you. There's a berth reserved on the last ship. Mark stared at the message for 17 seconds before responding. Tell them I'm conducting essential research. Academic obligations. The lie tasted like ashes and ethical compromise. But through the archive's transparent walls, he could see more refugee transports arriving from colonies the hegemony had sterilized. Families who'd lost everything, clutching children who would grow up as displaced persons because someone had decided their worlds weren't worth defending. In his desk drawer, he found Elena's last research project, Children's Folklore of the Outer Rim, 37 different lullabies from cultures that no longer existed. Stories parents told their children about heroes who saved everyone. Mark closed the file and opened Phase 4 protocols. The archive weapon, turning the university's own information systems into an intelligence maze that would convince the hegemony they were facing impossible tactical challenges. Phase 4, he whispered to his grandfather's compass. Weaponized bibliography. Heroes in children's stories didn't have to choose between lying and letting people die. Real heroes, apparently, did. The university's data systems contained the accumulated scholarly output of 12 civilizations, research papers, historical analyses, mathematical models, and academic cross-references representing centuries of intellectual collaboration. Mark was about to transform this peaceful archive into something that would make Machiavelli himself request a consultation. Computer, implement research protocol, cascading verification matrix. Mark commanded, his fingers dancing across interfaces designed for academic inquiry but functioning beautifully for applied information warfare. Cross-reference all queries against historical precedent databases with automatic citation generation. What Mark created was like a reference system with deliberately incorrect cross-references, an intelligence analyst's nightmare disguised as a scholar's dream. A system that responded to every hegemony information request with technically accurate data supporting completely false conclusions. The mechanism was mathematically elegant. When enemy intelligence queried sector defensive capabilities, the archive responded with legitimate academic papers about defensive installations. Real papers, written by real scholars, with proper peer review and mathematical verification. The papers just happened to describe installations Mark had carefully inserted into historical databases using techniques he euphemistically called retroactive research. Documentation. Query. Kepler Sector Defensive Infrastructure Assessment. He read from incoming hegemony requests. The university's systems responded with 17 scholarly articles about ancient defensive networks, 3 mathematical models of theoretical fortification systems, and a cross-referenced bibliography citing 47 additional sources. All technically accurate, all properly verified, all describing military capabilities that existed only in carefully constructed academic fiction. Mark watched enemy intelligence analysts drown in verified information that painted an increasingly impossible picture of defensive capabilities their sensors confirmed, but their tactical doctrine insisted couldn't exist. But as he implemented his final gambit, Operation Phantom Colony, his hands stopped trembling with nervous energy and started shaking with something else entirely: fear. The latest hegemony transmissions suggested their admiral was considering options that desperate commanders pursued when facing impossible defensive odds: total deployment, planet-killing weapons, strategies that prioritize sector denial over conquest. Intelligence Analysis Report 15 Alpha indicates sector contains previously unknown military technologies consistent with theoretical maximum defensive parameters. He read from intercepted communications. Recommend strategic assessment revision pending confirmation of archaeological military assets. Mark realized he'd convinced them so thoroughly that the Kepler sector was militarized that they were preparing to sterilize it, rather than risk occupation by forces they couldn't understand. Through his window, he could see Sefnara in the memorial garden, watering Elena's oak tree. Her crystalline features reflected worry patterns he'd learned to recognize over months of shared research. His grandfather's compass rose caught the emergency lighting like an accusation. Navigation isn't about knowing where you are. It's about knowing where you're going. Where was he going? And how many people would die when he got there? Mark's final deception required weaponizing the one thing every civilization in the galaxy respected: peer-reviewed academic research. But as he typed, his grandfather's voice echoed in memory. The most dangerous victory is one that turns you into the person you were fighting against. His hands paused over the keyboard. Around him, the archive hummed with the electrical discharge of overloaded systems and the weight of decisions that would reshape how civilizations thought about truth. Historical Research Update: Archaeological evidence of integrated defensive networks in academic institutions. Mark typed, creating documentation that would pass any scholarly review process in known space. Preliminary findings suggest educational facilities in contested regions were designed with dual-purpose infrastructure capable of sector-wide coordination. The research was academically impeccable, citing real archaeological surveys, referencing actual defensive technologies, including mathematical models demonstrating how educational institutions could theoretically coordinate military assets. Everything properly footnoted, cross-referenced, and verified through institutional channels. The only creative element was Mark's suggestion that such dual-purpose facilities might have been reactivated by civilian populations facing existential threats. Within hours, hegemony intelligence analysts were frantically requesting information about academic facility military conversion protocols and educational infrastructure defensive capabilities. Their queries flooded university databases, returning Mark's carefully curated research that painted an increasingly complex picture of hidden military assets. But Mark's hands froze over the keyboard when he intercepted Admiral Thex'rax's latest communication to Hegemony High Command. Sector defensive capabilities exceed analytical parameters. Recommend implementation protocol, Omega, total sterilization to prevent enemy technology acquisition by hostile forces. Civilian populations appear to be military assets operating under academic cover. Planetary bombardment authorized pending command confirmation. Mark stared at the transmission until the words blurred. He'd been so focused on convincing them the sector was too dangerous to attack that he'd made them decide it was too dangerous to leave intact. His tablet chimed with another message from Sefnara. Mark, where are you? The last evacuation transport leaves in 6 hours. Please respond. I'm not leaving without you. Mark looked around his improvised command center. Coffee cups, classified intelligence reports, and his grandfather's compass surrounded by the accumulated evidence of the most successful information warfare campaign in galactic history. A campaign that was about to get everyone he cared about killed. He thought of Elena's children's folklore research, of the Chen family's genealogy project, of Sefnara watering memorial trees for civilizations that existed now only in academic archives. Sometimes the most moral thing you can do is become someone your ethics professor warned you about. But what if your ethics professor was right? Computer, he said, voice hoarse from hours of strategic deception. Open direct communication protocols. Hegemony, command frequency, maximum priority override. Dr. Harrington. Admiral Thex'rax's voice crackled through the quantum arrays, strain evident even through military communications protocols. Are you initiating contact with enemy forces? Yes, Admiral, Mark replied, touching his grandfather's compass one final time. I'm about to do something my ethics professor definitely warned me about. Which is? Mark's smile carried the weight of 3 months spent becoming someone he barely recognized. Tell them the truth. The holographic communication array materialized Admiral Thex'rax with crystal clarity, a career military officer whose strategic assessment protocols were being systematically violated by evidence that suggested reality itself required fundamental revision. His posture carried the exhaustion of someone whose worldview had been under systematic assault for weeks. Admiral Thex'rax, Mark said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with hands that had stopped shaking because there was no point in being nervous about unavoidable conversations. This is Dr. Mark Harrington, Director of Archives, Kepler University. I believe we need to discuss your intelligence assessments. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that preceded either diplomatic breakthroughs or complete mental breakdown. Mark could hear his grandfather's compass ticking, or maybe that was his own heartbeat, echoing through the quantum arrays. You are the strategic authority responsible for sector defensive coordination? Admiral Thex'rax asked, his voice carrying undertones suggesting his understanding of military reality was experiencing catastrophic system failure. I'm the Librarian, Mark replied, with the patience of someone explaining basic research methodology to a particularly confused undergraduate, though recent events have expanded my job description considerably. Admiral Thex'rax's image flickered as he processed this information. Our intelligence indicates defensive capabilities that violate established physics, coordinated fleet movements in impossible formations, archaeological military assets that predate known civilizations, energy signatures that suggest technology beyond current galactic parameters. Mark pulled up displays showing the complete scope of his information warfare campaign. Educational simulations, fabricated research papers, retroactively documented historical installations, and academic verification systems turned into weapons of mass deception. The evidence of his months-long campaign spread across holographic interfaces like an archaeological dig, exposing layers of constructed truth. Admiral, he said carefully, organizing his explanation like a lecture he'd given 1,000 times, you've been fighting an enemy that exists entirely in properly documented academic research. Admiral Thex'rax studied the data with the expression of someone discovering that reality was significantly more negotiable than previously assumed. His military bearing remained intact, but Mark could see the moment when understanding finally crystallized. You convinced our entire intelligence apparatus that this sector contained military assets that don't exist? Oh, they exist, Mark replied with academic precision that would have made his dissertation committee proud. They exist in historical databases, research papers, mathematical models, and properly peer-reviewed scholarly analysis. They just don't exist in what you might call consensus physical reality. The Admiral was quiet for nearly 30 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not the professional calm of military command, but the genuine curiosity of someone encountering a completely new paradigm. Dr. Harrington, why didn't you simply deploy these capabilities against our forces? Mark leaned back in his chair, surrounded by the evidence of 3 months spent becoming someone his grandfather would have understood, but his ethics professor would have disowned. Through his window, he could see the memorial garden where Sefnara was still tending Elena's oak tree. Because the most effective victory is the one where everybody goes home alive, Admiral, even enemies. But if your defensive capabilities are fictional, what prevents us from completing our invasion objectives? Mark's smile carried the weight of someone who'd spent his entire academic career studying how desperate people survived impossible odds. The same thing that's always protected scholars from warriors, Admiral. We know things you need to understand, and destroying us means losing access to information that might save your civilization someday. Elaborate, Admiral. Your invasion succeeded because you understood your enemy's tactical doctrine better than they understood yours. But doctrine evolves, enemies adapt, and somewhere in this galaxy, someone is developing approaches to warfare that will make your current capabilities obsolete. Mark gestured to displays showing human historical precedents, asymmetric warfare techniques, information campaigns. strategic innovations that had allowed inferior forces to defeat superior ones throughout Earth's bloody history. "We're not offering military alliance, Admiral. We're offering education in methodologies your war colleges don't teach." Admiral Thex'rax was silent for 18 seconds before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions about power and survival. "And if we refuse? Then you complete your invasion, occupy the Kepler sector, and eventually encounter enemies who think like humans do about the relationship between truth and tactical advantage." Mark's voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who'd spent months proving theoretical concepts through practical application. "And when that happens, you'll wish you'd taken the class instead of killing the teachers." The communication array hummed with quantum static, while Admiral Thex'rax contemplated implications that would reshape hegemony strategic doctrine. Mark could see the moment when military precision encountered academic possibility and found them surprisingly compatible. "Dr. Harrington," the Admiral said finally, "I believe we require immediate consultation regarding defensive information protocols." Mark touched his grandfather's compass and smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose research had finally found its proper application. The old brass instrument had guided his family through uncertain waters for 3 generations. Now it would help guide civilizations through uncertain truths. "I'll prepare the curriculum, Admiral." 3 months after the hegemony discovered that academic research could be more dangerous than antimatter torpedoes, Kepler University had become something unprecedented in galactic history, an educational institution that officially taught courses in applied creative truth management. Mark's morning began as it always had, cataloging new acquisitions, updating cross-reference systems, ensuring the universe's accumulated knowledge remained accessible to anyone curious enough to ask dangerous questions. The difference was that his students now included Admiral Thex'rax's strategic planning staff, diplomatic corps from 7 civilizations, and Admiral Thex'rax himself, who attended lectures with the dedicated attention of someone whose career depended on understanding how humans approach the relationship between information and survival. His office had expanded into something that looked like a war room, designed by a particularly aggressive librarian. Maps shared wall space with bibliographies. Strategic assessments were filed alphabetically, alongside scholarly articles. His grandfather's compass held place of honor on a desk that had become command central for the galaxy's first academic program in defensive deception. "Professor Harrington," Admiral Thex'rax said, entering with the careful respect of someone who'd learned that librarians were significantly more dangerous than previously assumed, "My analysts have completed assessment of your recommended reading." Mark looked up from grading papers on asymmetric information advantages in historical context, assignments that would have horrified ethics committees across the galaxy, and smiled with the patient expression of someone who'd discovered that teaching aliens to think creatively was remarkably similar to traditional academic instruction. "Your assessment, Admiral?" "Terrifying," Thex'rax replied with honesty that suggested months of having his fundamental assumptions about reality systematically deconstructed. If these methodologies were implemented systematically, conventional military intelligence would become unreliable across the galaxy. "Which is exactly why we're teaching them in an academic setting," Mark replied, gesturing to syllabi that treated information warfare like any other scholarly discipline. "Better to understand these capabilities in a controlled educational environment than encounter them during actual conflicts." Through his office windows, Mark could see the memorial garden where they'd planted trees for every colony the hegemony had sterilized before learning that some victories cost more than defeat. Elena's oak was growing strong, its branches reaching toward light with the persistence of something that refused to be forgotten. The memorial served as a reminder that academic exercises had real-world consequences, and that the most effective weapons were often the ones that prevented violence rather than caused it. Sefnara entered carrying coffee and enrollment statistics, her crystalline features reflecting satisfaction patterns Mark had learned to associate with successful research outcomes. "Applications have increased 847% this quarter," she reported. "We have requests from 17 different species, including 3 that officially don't exist." Mark accepted the coffee, still terrible, but somehow essential to the process of revolutionizing galactic military doctrine, and reviewed his calendar. Morning lectures on historical precedent analysis for contemporary applications. Afternoon seminars on narrative engineering in conflict resolution. Evening consultations with intelligence agencies that were learning to think like librarians instead of warriors. His tablet chimed with a message from Galactic Defense Command, Dr. Harrington. Intelligence reports suggest potential hostile forces in the Outer Rim sectors, utilizing unconventional reconnaissance methods. Request immediate consultation regarding defensive information protocols. Mark smiled and began packing his research materials. His grandfather's compass, annotated copies of Earth's military history, and lesson plans for teaching aliens how to think like humans about the strategic applications of creative truth management. Somewhere in the galaxy, someone else was probably planning to start a war using conventional military thinking. They were about to discover what happened when peaceful academics decided that preventing violence was worth getting professionally creative about. Sefnara, Mark called to his research assistant, who'd become the galaxy's leading expert on mathematical modeling of irrational enemy behavior. Prepare the advanced curriculum materials. We're going to teach another workshop on applied narrative engineering. The full curriculum? She asked, her crystalline features reflecting excitement that would have confused her younger self. Everything, Mark replied, touching his grandfather's compass with the satisfaction of someone whose research had found its proper application. Fair fights are for people who can afford to lose. Everyone else needs to learn how to get creative. As he prepared to leave, Mark paused at Elena's memorial entry in the archive system. Her research on children's folklore had become the foundation for his course on cultural information preservation in conflict zones. Her lullabies were being translated into 17 languages and taught to military academies as examples of how civilizations survived by remembering what they valued. Elena would have laughed at the irony. Her academic research about children's songs being used to teach generals about strategic thinking. Mark locked his office and prepared to conduct more field research. After all, the universe contained infinite opportunities for applied narrative engineering, and someone had to make sure the good guys won by being smarter than everyone else expected. 6 months after Admiral Thex'rax's surrender, Mark Harrington sat in his expanded office, surrounded by thank you letters from civilizations that had resolved conflicts through academic consultation rather than mutual annihilation. His grandfather's compass rose caught the morning light from Kepler's twin suns, its brass surface worn smooth by 3 generations of fingers seeking direction in uncertain times. The compass no longer just pointed toward magnetic north. It had become something else, a reminder that navigation worked the same whether you were trying to find home or help others lose their way. The important thing was knowing which direction you were really heading. Sefnara entered carrying the morning intelligence briefing and a cup of coffee that had somehow evolved from terrible to merely challenging. 3 new conflicts resolved this week using Information Archaeology Institute methodologies, she reported. The vegan-Rigel border dispute was settled when both sides realized their territorial claims were based on historical maps our graduates had creatively annotated. Mark accepted the briefing and smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose research had prevented another war. His calendar showed the usual mixture of academic obligations and strategic consultations, teaching courses on applied truth management, consulting with diplomatic corps about narrative engineering for peace negotiations, and reviewing applications from civilizations that wanted to learn how to think like humans about creative problem-solving. The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 months of convincing the galaxy's most sophisticated military intelligence that his history books were weapons had somehow led to the most peaceful period in recorded galactic history. Apparently, when everyone knew that information could be weaponized, nobody wanted to start fights they might not understand. Dr. Harrington, Sefnara said carefully, setting down her tablet with the precision of someone about to ask a question that had been troubling her for months. I've been wondering about something, which is your grandfather's compass. You touch it whenever you're making difficult decisions. What did he tell you about navigation? Mark looked at the brass instrument that had guided 3 generations of his family through uncertain waters literal and metaphorical, and felt the weight of everything that had changed since he'd first opened his laptop, and decided to get creative about survival. He said the most important thing about navigation isn't knowing where you are, Mark replied, tracing the compass rose's edge with fingers that had typed humanity's first formal curriculum in applied creative truth management. It's knowing where you're going and being willing to adjust your course when the currents change. And where are we going? Mark looked around his office. Lesson plans for teaching aliens to lie creatively. Thank you letters from civilizations that had learned to resolve conflicts through academic discourse, and enrollment applications from species who wanted to understand how humans had accidentally revolutionized warfare by treating it like a research project. Through his window, the memorial garden had grown into something beautiful. Elena's oak tree was thriving, its branches now strong enough to support a small plaque. Dr. Elena Vasquez, she saved the lullabies. Below it, children from 12 different species played games that incorporated folktales from worlds that might have been lost forever. Toward a universe where the smartest people in the room also happened to be the most dangerous, he said, opening his laptop to begin work on Advanced Strategic Truth Management, a practical guide to information warfare for peaceful purposes. And if that makes us the kinds of people our ethics professors warned us about, Mark's smile would have made his grandfather proud. And possibly his ethics professor too, though she'd never admit it. Then we make sure we're the good guys, Sefnara, because someone has to be clever enough to protect everyone else. His tablet chimed with another consultation request, this time from a civilization, facing invasion by enemies who'd learned to fight using human tactical innovations. The message was marked, priority, existential, and came with a footnote that made Mark laugh despite himself. Please bring full curriculum. Enemy forces appear to have attended our competitors' workshops. The irony was beautiful. Mark Harrington had become so effective at teaching creative warfare that he now specialized in defending against his own methodology. Somewhere in the galaxy, his academic papers were being used by both sides of conflicts, creating a strange new form of academic arms race, where the winner was determined by who could think most creatively about thinking creatively. The universe, it seemed, had developed a sense of humor about the relationship between education and survival. Mark touched his grandfather's compass one final time and began drafting his response to beings who needed to learn how to think like humans, about the strategic applications of applied creativity. Sefnara, he said, pulling up travel itineraries and packing lists, prepare the emergency curriculum package. Looks like we're going to conduct field research on the practical applications of defensive academic methodology. The full program, everything we've learned about turning libraries into fortifications and making truth subordinate to survival. Mark's voice carried the quiet satisfaction of someone whose research had finally found its proper application. After all, fair fights are still for people who can afford to lose. And we? Mark looked at his reflection in the compass face. Wire-rimmed glasses, academic demeanor, and eyes that had learned to see strategic applications in everything from children's lullabies to filing systems. He'd become exactly the kind of person his grandfather would have understood and his younger self would have found morally questionable. We make sure the right people win, Sefnara, by any means necessary that can be properly cited. As he prepared to leave for another consultation in applied creative truth management, Mark paused at Elena's memorial file one last time. Her research had become the cornerstone of information preservation theory, the academic discipline that studied how civilizations survived by remembering what they valued and forgetting what their enemies expected them to know. Elena would have appreciated the academic elegance of it, her children's folklore research being used to teach military strategists that the most powerful weapon wasn't the ability to destroy your enemy's culture, but the ability to preserve your own while convincing your enemy that you'd lost everything worth fighting for. Mark Harrington, Director of Applied Information Studies and the galaxy's first Professor of Strategic Truth Management, locked his office and prepared to conduct more field research. The final entry in his personal log that day read, Navigation Update. Course adjusted for maximum educational impact. Destination, wherever the good guys need to learn how to be more dangerous than the bad guys expect. Weather conditions, favorable for applied narrative engineering. Estimated time of arrival: whenever someone needs to discover that the most effective battles are won before anyone realizes they're fighting them. His grandfather's compass pointed steadily north. But Mark had learned that sometimes the most important direction was the one that led away from fair fights and toward creative solutions. After all, the universe was full of people who needed to learn that knowledge, properly applied, wasn't just power over information. It was power over the stories people told themselves about what was possible. And in the end, that was the only power that really mattered.